and welcome to Dialogue. Politics in Europe have been in the spotlight as elections in France and the UK show center-leftist victories against a growing conservative surge in much of Europe. What will be the new government in France as a new left-wing coalition beats back the right, but no party holds a majority in parliament? And what new policies might we see in the UK, which now has a new prime minister and a new parliament? And what is the significance of these elections as the future of Europe is shifting to the right? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Jeremie, Director of Chinform of the Sino-European Cross-Culture Training Center, Professor Iain Begg from the London School of Economics and Political Science, Joan Ross, Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies of Renmin University of China, and Professor Joav Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris. Welcome to Dialogue. Jeremie, I will start with you. So the final results of the French parliamentary election show the left-wing New Popular Front, or NFP, will be the biggest party in France's parliament. President Macron's centrist alliance in second place, and the far right, which was feared, let's say, National Rally, came out on top in the first round, but now down in the third place. So no party has a majority. Is the result a surprise to you?
Yeah, certainly. I was very surprised by the result. I think there could be three reasons to explain my surprise. The first one, on the 9th of June this year, there was European Parliament elections. For many Frenchmen, it was not very important. And they voted massively for the National Rally to sanction the French government. This is a warning. Okay, this is the first point. The second point is that after the elections, the president has dissolved the parliament. Okay, and now we have 10 days ago, so we have the first round of elections. And the people in France continue to sanction the government, so they voted massively at the National Rally. This is the second point. The third point is that in the first 10 days ago, the National Rally had 31%. It's very, very high, very, very high. So Frenchmen are frightened, they are shocked. So that's why yesterday there was a second round of votes, and Frenchmen participated massively to keep the democracy in this country, and especially young people. That's why the National Rally became, at a surprise of everyone, to the third place. Mm-hmm. However, the left party, they have united. They have an agreement before the final round, and the union makes forces. That's why they have won.
Okay, so Professor Toker, how do you explain this surprising surge, especially for from the new left-wing coalition, which was formed just a couple of days ago, basically before the announcement by President Macron for a snap election?
There is, shall I say, mechanical explanation, which is related to the French political electoral system in two rounds, which gives sort of a bonus to the large blocs, large parties, large groups. So if some of those groups get together, they are advantaged by the system itself. And that explains what happened between the first and the second round of these parliamentary elections. But that's only the surface and the mechanics. Beyond that, there's something more profound, which consists of, on one hand, the fact that France as a whole is still skeptical in a way, and perhaps afraid to some extent, when it comes to the major gesture of deposing central political power in the hands of the extreme right. You know that the extreme right in Europe, in France, is associated World War II with the occupation, with the cohabitation, as they call it, with Nazi regimes, and very heavy element in French relatively recent history. So it is possible that French population as a whole, in spite of the great support and the constant progress in the electoral power of the National Front, the population as a whole is still hesitating in giving that party, when its leaders, the full power, or something which resembles the full power. And this is what we have to watch, because we are now in a very awkward situation in which a large majority of French men and women voted on the right, center-right and right, and the largest party represented in parliament is of the left, and perhaps there would be some circumstances which would impose on President Macron to nominate a prime minister who is actually left to govern a country which is actually very clearly on the right-hand side of political preferences.
Interesting development there. So Iain, sitting in London, looking at the elections in France, in the first round, you have this, of course, very important, let's say, progress or votes by the right, the National Rally. And then the second round, it's a surprise for a lot of people. How do you look at this, the votes gained by the right, and then somehow it's not probably that a threat anymore?
It's still a threat. But I would add to what Professor Toker said two things. The first is that the opposition to the Rassemblement National, the right-wing or far-right party, consisted of the other party saying, we will make sure that in the majority of individual seats, we field only one candidate against them. Sometimes it was the left bloc, sometimes it was the Macron party, which is known as Ensemble or Together. And this is the continuation of a policy that has been adopted by the French elites for many decades, which is to impose what they call the cordon sanitaire, or to insulate the main body of French politics from the influence of the far right. It worked when Jean-Marie Le Pen was the candidate. It worked when Marine Le Pen was the candidate. But in the interim, the far right has gradually edged up. And the second thing to observe is that part of Macron's motivation in this is not for today, it's for in 3 years' time when he steps down as president. One thing he wants to do is to make sure that Marine Le Pen of the far right does not develop herself as a credible candidate to succeed him. There isn't yet another one, but he is opposed to allowing Marine Le Pen the possibility of gaining in 2027. So these background effects are very significant in the way that this has evolved.
That's true. So John, now can we say there's a Han government, Han parliament basically in France, because there's no clear majority of any party. So when it comes to the choice of the prime minister, there's probably the involvement of many parties to build a, let's say, coalition-based government there. That will take some time?
Well, I would assume so. I mean, if you look at the left itself is rather divided. You have the Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is the France Unbowed, who's been very popular but has very clear positions. For example, on the question of Palestine, he supports the Palestinians against Israel, whereas the other groups in France that are in the left have been supporting Israel. And those types of divisions are going to come up. Macron's tactic is quite clear. He wants to try to detach the other left-wing parties, the socialists and the Greens, from Mélenchon's party and form some sort of type centre government. I'm not able to tell whether he will succeed in that, but that's quite clear what his tactics were. I think he was rather surprised, not merely by the second round, but I think he was very surprised by the first round, because he had thought, I think one of his reasons for calling the election was that he had believed that the left would be splintered and divided, and therefore there would be a big vote for his centrist bloc. Instead, the left got itself together in an extremely rapid period of time, within 48 hours, and instead he suffered the defeat of it being the left seeming to be the most powerful force against Le Pen instead of what he'd wanted, which was his centre bloc. So I think Macron, that's probably why he said almost nothing after the first round, was shocked not merely by the second round, he was shocked by the first round as well.
I think probably people will agree with John that President Macron is shocked with the results. Jeremie, but anyway, there will be a government. What kind of role President Macron will play in terms of forming, obviously, a coalition government, or is there any standing out figure to be the choice?
According to the French constitutions, the biggest party winners should produce a prime minister, inside of the Popular Front, But the problem is that this party, this group is composed of 4 parties. You have the Mélenchon's party, your Socialist Party, Green parties, and also Communist Party. So they are also today. So we have seen the cracks, the divisions inside of these groups. So I think that probably Mr. Macron will name someone of his own party as a prime minister, and we rely on the left-right coalition. And as the professor said, why not Socialist Greens to form a coalition? Just to remind you that in France, the majority, absolutely majority, is the 289 seats. But the Macron's party has only 153 parts, so he lacks about 140. So he has to build an extended coalition. It's a very tough job.
Very tough job. Professor Toker, you agree? Very tough job, but the possibility is still that someone probably of the choice of the president, but with the support maybe from the left.
Yeah, that looks so arithmetically when you take a piece of paper and put the numbers and try to add up. It doesn't work this way in politics in general, and it even works even less so in French politics. Don't forget that France has a constitution which had established about 60 years ago an extremely centralized presidential regime. It was actually done in order to get rid of all the combinations and alliances and counter-alliances which had characterized decades of French politics before the 50s and 40s and earlier of last century. So I don't think there's any other Western democratic country which has such a degree of centralism and which deposits so much power in the hands of the president, who is elected separately from the parliament and who has enormous prerogatives. Now, what happens in a case such as this, which is in a way unprecedented? The president is still, according to the constitution, the power which regulates issues related to defense and foreign affairs, and the government, who could very well be headed by someone from the opposition camp, is the body which runs the country. Now, of course, that also sounds very much like a formula which could work out in laboratories of political science. But with this opposition right now, and with this level of division my colleague had mentioned a few minutes ago, you can't actually see rationally whoever can Macron nominate, at least over the political scenery, who would be accepted by all the other partners of this extremely unprecedented political cocktail.
Mm-hmm. Well, challenging times ahead. Lastly, Jeremie, before you go, do you expect, what kind of policy do you expect out of the new government, based on the parliamentary election? So mostly, I guess, economic policy. Will people be happy with the new government in terms of policy, in terms of management of the country?
I would say the biggest winners in these elections is the populist parties, is Mélenchon, socialists, etc. But I think their economic policies are not credible. They have provided a lot of promises to the Frenchmen. For example, this increased the minimum salary by 14%, okay, and put the ceilings on a lot of prices. something like and cancel the laws of retirement at the 64 age. You know, it will cost a lot of money to the French, taxpayers. It cannot last. So I would say, I prefer that Mr. Macron's policies will still be maintained in the countries, because it has begun, it's successful, it's produce good results. So I hope that the liberal economic policy will be maintained. It's more in line with Frenchmen's expectations.
Well, let's shift to another election very nearby, like in the UK, of course. Joav, so that's the election witnessed the end of 14 years of conservative rule. Now we have the Labour Party running the country. What do you think has caused the end of the conservative rule?
Well, the total fact that the living standards of Britain haven't gone up for more than a decade, and the Conservatives have been in power for most of that period, and therefore they're blamed for it. So it was a complete revolt against the Conservative Party. What was interesting is that it was not, although it's a parliamentary landslide, it was not in the slightest a vote landslide for the Labour Party. It's the majority government formed with the lowest percentage of the vote in British history. That's the first thing. And perhaps even more striking is the fact that they got less votes, the Labour Party, than in Jeremy Corbyn, not merely in 2017, but they got less votes than Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. So despite the declaration that this was a new, very popular type of Labour Party, the facts were completely against it. And they have therefore got very fragile popular support. And they're going to become very unpopular extremely quickly, because their fundamental promise is that they're not going to change anything basic compared to what the Conservatives have done on the most crucial economic issues, particularly on taxation and expenditure. There'll be a few changes, for example, already announced. They're going to stop the ban on onshore wind and things that. But this is tickling around the edges. So basically, they've promised to do the same as the Conservative Party was doing, and therefore they will become extremely unpopular very rapidly, just as the Conservative government did.
So, Iain, do you agree? Probably, Joav is not that optimistic with the new Labour government in terms of their promise or how they can do, or how much they can do, rather, probably in the near future.
No, I don't agree. I think the key thing to notice is that although the new government is constrained on public finances because of the high public debt that the Conservative Party has left behind, which is nearly 100% of GDP, they're proposing to do things which involve regulatory developments as much as public expenditure developments. One example is something that's going to happen very quickly, which is an easing of the land use planning restrictions, which have been very onerous in the UK and have prevented house building and made it very difficult to engage in investment in infrastructure. It's not easy because we have an expression that I'm sure you're familiar with of NIMBY, not in my backyard, where the local population says, well, we don't want a housing development here, put it somewhere else.
Yeah.
But that is going to change, and it's going to change quite rapidly. There's a massive housing problem in the UK. Too few houses, more people coming into the country through immigration, too little infrastructure, and much of that infrastructure is very heavily used in a way which means that if something slightly goes wrong, like snow at Heathrow Airport, it collapses almost immediately. So that kind of change in the regulatory side will be important. But also another significant area of change will be in the approach to the National Health Service, which has been struggling for many years, not just because of the pandemic, but because it's very much orientated towards treatment and not so much orientated towards prevention. The new health secretary is promising quite a radical approach to this, not necessarily involving more money, but a different approach to how those health services are managed and provided. These are things which are significant, particularly in the UK context, where health is such a big component of decisions between the parties.
So, John, obviously, anyway, in the sense of the people's expectation, it's really about whether the Labour government will be up to the expectation of the public. For example, in the first 100 days. I mean, if they can do so, things will get probably easier.
Yeah, but I think that first is I don't think that the public has big expectations about the government. I think that they voted against the Conservative Party. As I say, they're lower votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017, 2019. And if you look at Starmer's position, for example, he's lost 18,000 votes since 2017 in his own constituency. So I don't think the public has any illusions in them. Secondly, I think that the prospects that will carry through in the health service will probably be damaging because you have to spend more money. And basically the aim is to move towards a more privatized health service. And the experience of the United States shows what happens when you have more privatization in the health service. I mean, they have a private health service, which is unbelievably inefficient, takes 18% of GDP, delivers lower life expectancy than any advanced country. And if we go towards that type of health service, we negative and simply altering regulation without actual spending the money won't make any improvement. So obviously you can come back and interview in 2 years' time. You can interview me and
have you again,
other people and
both of you,
and see, we can judge. I think that the government will become extremely unpopular very rapidly because it doesn't propose to change anything. The alternative view is it'll be they're making significant changes. 2 years' time, get us back, and one of us will apologise, and one of us will say I was right.
Let me bring in Professor Toker. Obviously, a professor in the UK has met some, let's say, experienced, I would say, a quite challenging situation for many, many years. Since 2008 financial crisis, of course, then you have Brexit, and they have the pandemic. Then you have this, living crisis. The Conservative government, they had tried to manage that. I think they failed. So the challenges are huge, massive for the Labour government. What's your expectation? Are they capable of doing that? In particular, the new Prime Minister, Mr. Starmer.
Well, it has to be not only wait and see, of course, which is the obvious reason, but which is a way of not answering the question. I think that the Labour government would, once again, mechanically enjoy a sort of a golden short to medium range period during which, because of the change and because of the thirst for change in British population, that it would be able to pass legislation to accelerate operations in crucial domains such as health and education and transportation and others. I'm not sure that would be the case when it comes to diplomacy and foreign policy and defense options. And I rather agree with my colleague who said a few minutes ago that this new Labour government might lose a large portion of its popularity rather soon. But this is not a British phenomena. This is practically what you see all over the place in the West. Governments, whether they come after 14 very long years of one-sided domination in power, or whether they just switch more frequently between left and right, conservatives and liberals and other variations, they don't keep the level of popularity and adhesion of the population for a long period. It's true in the United States, it's true in Western Europe, it's true in other democratic small and large powers in the world. And I think that this is going to be the case with the United Kingdom this time as well.
Iain, your response?
It's important to recognise that the British system, in spite of the low share of the vote that the Labour Party won, provides a very, very strong majority. And that means the Labour Party has 5 years in which it is not going to face any realistic opposition from any other party. In fact, the only opposition might well come from within the party rather than from outside. Some of the explanations for that share of the vote are unusual ones. The Conservatives lost to a more far-right group called Reform. The Labour Party lost some votes, including one of its proposed front bench team, because of a very strong Muslim pro-Gaza vote in some constituencies. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Keir Starmer now has 5 years in which he can really impose whatever policies he judges to be correct. Naturally, he wants to have a second 5-year term, but I don't think he has any threat to his capability to govern over the next 5 years.
Well, in addition to that, of course, we see the Scottish National Party, was virtually wiped out. How do you make of this fact?
Well, I think the explanation is the same as for the Conservative Party losing, which is a narrative of time for a change. The Conservatives had been in power for 14 years. The Nationalists in Scotland had been in power for 17 years, and they had an accumulation of things going wrong. In short, the electorate was fed up with them, and that is part of the story. It does put independence more or less out of the question for the foreseeable future.
Then, John, of course, in terms of foreign affairs, now we have a new government. If you look at the UK's relationship with China, which was at low ebb between the two countries, of course. So any change, any expectations, something will probably come back to bring the relationship back on track?
No, I'd love to say that it would do, but I'm afraid you've got to be realistic, and it won't. The Labour government's position, as is usual with British governments, is to do whatever the United States wants. And the person who went against that, for example, Cameron, for example, the United States made very clear its displeasure. And we had it was therefore followed by a Conservative government, which essentially followed the United States. It kicked Huawei out of the telecommunications system when Huawei had been there for ages. Which means we get 5G later and more expensively than is necessary. But if that's what the United States demands, that's what will be done. We've got bad relations with China when London could have been one of the key places for Chinese companies to set themselves up. The government will be under pressure economically, but its decision, if it has to choose between the interests of Britain and the interests of the United States, it will choose the interests of the United States. And that I'm afraid is going to continue. So I'd love to tell you there's going to be a change. The judgment about the situation, no, there's not going to be a change.
Professor Toker, if you look at the European-wide, UK and the EU parliamentary elections, for example, there's a concern on the inside of the EU that the society is turning to the right because the rise of the right-wing parties. But now in the UK, we have say Labour win. People say, despite the facts, the driving force behind the changing patterns at the polls is the same. It's fundamentally similar. Voters are desperate for change. Do you agree?
I agree that there is a very prominent desire of the European electorate as a whole for a change. Of course, it's more outlined in some countries than others. That's natural. But what is important to signal is the fact that what we saw in France and what we saw in Britain over the last 5 days is not what we saw on the level of the European Parliament about 3 weeks ago when the parliamentary European election taking place in 27 different countries. We saw actually a movement towards the right and the extreme right, but to a degree which was lower, which was more limited than what most commentators and politicians had expected. So yes, the European Parliament moves right now to the right, but not in a dramatic way. The major two political groups of the center and center-right who had dominated the present actual parliament are going to keep their influence over the coming 5 years.
All right.
So I wouldn't expect that
stop there,
political,
Professor.
sociological change to make a difference.
Like stability or rather consistency will continue, sort of. On that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.